Good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking with David Farmer about two films, documentary films, both of them about jazz artists. One's called What Happened to Miss Simone, talking about Nina Simone, and the other one is Birth of the Cool by Miles Davis. And it's interesting as to how those two artists interact. And David, thank you for joining me on this discussion.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And it's interesting, both artists, kind of came prominent during the 1960s, and both had some similarities in terms of background, with having brief stints at Juilliard Music School. Both seem to have had some violence in their lives, which we can talk about. And the films were a little bit different in terms of orientation. And it was interesting that with Nina Simone, it was more about her and in terms of who she was and what kinds of things she was doing and her activism and so forth. As to Miles, it was more as to his music. But with Miles, you still found out quite a bit about his life, and you still heard quite a bit of music from Nina. So it was interesting.
And they both are both available on Netflix, streaming on Netflix. One's the What Happened, Miss Simone. The title comes from Maya Angelou. A quote from Maya Angelou is a 2015 biographical film by a woman named Liz Garbus. And it's a 90% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. And Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool is a 2019 film, also available on Netflix, which has a 92 fresh rating on the tomato meter. And so they're both excellent documentaries. And lots of, for those of you who already know them, you'll learn something new, but it's also just a pleasure to both revisit their music and also to understand the pain and, frankly, torture that both of them endured in their lives.
Yeah, I learned an awful lot about Nina Simone that I did not know. I had no knowledge that she had a violence in her family relationship with her husband. I mean, when I started watching the film and some of the scenes, I started flashing on Tina Turner and with the relationship with Ike.
Right.
I mean, it's remarkable that these two icons from that same time period both had such violent relationships with husband. Though I think Nina's was more violent than Nina.
I think that's right. And of course, Miles was on the other side of that equation because he had multiple wives and had multiple abuse issues with them. So they were on both the male and female side of the abuse problem that's, still persists today.
Yes, it certainly hasn't gone away. And if anything, it's as much a problem as it's ever been. But with Miles, it wasn't really clear. Just it seemed to be totally when he was into the drugs, but it wasn't as clear a path as was played out with Nina Simone.
True. They both, of course, had they were both seminal jazz artists. One, the American art form. Although film is sometimes credited as being an American art form, and I think that's a mixed bag. But jazz is definitely a definitive American art form.
Absolutely.
and they are giants in that world, share both a classic music background. Both attended briefly Juilliard. Nina was playing since she was 3-4 years old on piano and was guided by a classic teacher, and of course favored Bach especially. And that's the magic in her piano work, is these jazz riffs with incredible Bach kind of riffs underneath. Amazing stuff. And they both were expats abroad. In France, they shared at different times. Interesting, the generation, because they're 7 years apart. So they were arguably of a different generation. 7 years is enough to make they say a generation is 20 years, but I think a 7-year puts them in different. They kind of came up, because Miles was cooking even in the 40s, and certainly through the 50s. Nina emerges in the 50s and they both kind of have a apotheosis in the 1960s, and that's where my first acquaintance with both of them comes, and I think for you as well.
That's true. Did you ever see either one of them live?
I never saw either of them live. No.
Yeah, I saw Nina Simone perform once. Now, actually, she was up in South Lake Tahoe. Before seeing the documentary film, if you'd asked me when was it, I would have said 1968. But now that after watching the film and the sequence of her life, it must have been 67 that I saw her perform. Right. And it was quite a performance. There wasn't much chatter. It was strictly the music, and that was fine.
Right.
That's the reason I was there.
Well, for both of them too, their latter years were not their best and brightest in many people's views. For Miles, he went into this. He was always recreating himself and his music, and it was always about the now, and that's to his credit. But the now of the late work is, in many listeners' ears, is noise, and it is in mine as well. Except the one song he did in the later years, where he was sort of playing with pop music stuff, was Time After Time, the Cyndi Lauper piece. I love that piece.
Everybody does.
Oh man,
how could you not love it?
Exactly, and that, together with Sketches in Spain, are the Miles things that are, among many others, are the things that really stand out in their work. With Nina, she got arguably trapped by the movement, in the sense that she embraced the, Stokely Carmichael, most strident, violence is the only way. I must say, though, in her music, Mississippi Goddamn is still an incredibly moving piece.
Yes.
But she did, she kind of, that was sort of the latter part of her life. That's what I think she got a little bit trapped.
And the movie implies she also she was bipolar.
Right.
And I hadn't heard that. That was the first time I heard that.
Right.
I was a little surprised by that. But that would explain some of the behavior. But there's no question that she did not keep performing at the same level that she once did.
Right. Well, she was in such pain too. And both, I guess, Miles, Miles might well have been bipolar as well, but he was with his drug and alcohol abuse, he was self-medicating. Again, I'm
Yeah.
armchair disclaimer. I'm armchair psychologist, but and of course the whole thing with the artist being, essentially bipolar is the gift to the artist, because you have these incredible frenzied of creation of high, and then the inevitable down. But my armchair philosophy is we're all autistic, we're all bipolar, we're all the spectrums. It's just that in some cases environment pushes us in one way or another. I think that's true of both Nina as well as and of course Nina, we have to acknowledge her real name was Eunice Kathleen Wayman, right?
Right. Yeah. It just shows how little I really knew of her background. I didn't realize that she had adopted her own name. And it was an interesting story as to the reason she did so, because she didn't want her mother to know that she was performing in nightclubs.
Yep.
And so, and then the name, and given that to the Simone, and then she ends up in France. But with the European connection in the latter part of her life, there again, you got kind of almost like a Tina Turner relationship again, because that's where Tina Turner lives right now. So I think it's Switzerland, not France.
Right. Well, and both of them were incredibly touched by the totally different racial climate in France, especially, where far from being treated American style, they were respected as artists, as people, and was it moments of grace for them, for both of them.
Both Miles and Nina.
Yes.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. What was also interesting, I didn't realize just with Miles that given his age, that he actually started out playing with Bird and with Dizzy Gillespie. I mean, those opening scenes are really very, very entertaining.
Yes.
You don't see that much with Bird, and that was interesting. And
well, and also too,
he just kept growing.
Because he's a phenomenon by himself. But the fact of his sort of roots going back to those giants, the pedigree continues on. It's sort of like in literature from the Irish writers, from Yeats down to Samuel Beckett. And Joyce. There's this.
They build on each other.
Yeah.
Build on each other.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No. Miles just kept growing and growing. But it was interesting. And then that scene, I had remembered when it played out, reading about it at the time, that about him being beat up by the New York cop.
Yeah.
But, given today's stories with some of the police brutality issues, it's that particular short scene, I think he even impacts more than it probably did when the documentary came out.
Well, and it couldn't have happened that was literally around Birth of the Cool. He was at the top of his game, and the cop beat him up under the marquee, which had his name on it.
Right.
So, it was just, and the picture that comes across of Miles as a person was, he was kind of surly. He was sort of didn't suffer fools gladly. He was not sort of reminds me of Dylan in the early days. My brother once approached Dylan at Gertie's Folk City, where he was just beginning, and started chatting him up, and Dylan didn't have nothing to do with that. He was not. And same with Miles. He was not a chatty Cathy at all.
Oh no, 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 no. He was definitely very, very singular. Um, but it's an amazing the artists that he brought together. I mean, Ron Carter on the bass. I mean,
Yep,
Wayne Shorter, who I think just recently passed away,
he did. Yeah.
and Herbie Hancock. Um, even that later stage when he really wasn't at his top of his personal game, he still kept the artists around him that were uh, really were at the best of the best.
Well, the fascinating thing I found in that too was the method of doing these albums, of coming in with just sort of maybe semi sketches and ideas and basically letting them rip, that he not only recruited very talented not even the background, they really were the mainstays, but he allowed them and ultimately the best music that was made was out of this spontaneity, but very careful listening and responding. And it's just amazing, the
Yes.
process, just totally amazing, and not preformed. It was of the moment. And that's Miles. He's of the moment.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why the documentary is worth watching, because it does go into that kind of detail in terms of how the music was made,
Right.
um, and how the man interfaced with his own music. But it doesn't really explain, how he could at there at the end walk away from the trumpet and just not for 6, 7 years, play, before he had that last little spurt, and he
Right.
didn't look that healthy um, when he was playing right there at the end.
Right. Right. And the music certainly wasn't anything like um, it was maybe in the now, because it was a lot of odd stuff and rock and roll happening at that time too. And he was trying to kind of capture some of that, I think, but
Right?
he was not, it was not a healthy time for him at all. And he died at 65.
Yeah, he was a young man.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Nina managed to
Another
make it
five
to
years.
70. Yeah, make it to 70. But, and her end was not very healthy either.
No, no, neither one. Um, the second half of their life was nowhere near what the first half was.
Yeah.
Um, it would have been interesting to with Miles if they had a little more in terms of his personal life, though. I mean, I he did keep in contact with his two children, but you really didn't get any sense of what was their relationship. Um, and I would like to know a little more about that.
Well, it's interesting too, because he apparently his will was an interesting piece of trivia here. He didn't leave equal amounts. See, his estate was left like at $2 million in today's dollars, um, and it basically he left 20% to his daughter Cheryl, 40% to his son Aaron, and 10% to his nephew Vincent, and 15% each to his brother Vernon and his sister Dorothy. He excluded two sons, Gregory and Miles the Fourth, for, I guess, being bad boys in his view. But the interesting thing is the daughter and the son and the nephew became essentially the gatekeepers for his legacy. They are the producers of that Miles Davis Birth of the Cool film, and they are keeping the flame alive and it looks like that's what Miles had in mind in his legacy.
Well, I guess consistent with the will, but the film really doesn't really mention the two other kids.
No, totally.
Yeah, that's why I only referenced the one son and the daughter.
Right.
So that's interesting. Nina only had the one child, and that relationship was interesting too, in terms of her going back and forth between after Nina got divorced and then went to Ghana. Was it Ghana she went to? No, Liberia.
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 Yeah.
Um, and then she then becoming abusive to her daughter.
Right.
After having abuse, suffering abuse herself.
Well, I
So,
think both of them stand for the proposition, I guess it's well documented and established, that those who are abused more often than not become abusers.
that's
And,
true.
and I
That's
think
true.
in both cases, that they're examples of that.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. Um, um, but it's still surprising.
Yeah.
Even though I am aware of that occurring. Um, but with Nina, I mean, it would have been nice on that film to have a little bit more of her early performance work. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and and it really is. It's also interesting with her that her ex-husband did cooperate with the filmmaking, because there is quite a bit of interviews with him that are interspaced with the film.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's apparently, at least as of the time the film was made, he was still alive. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. But here, very interesting background, a cop, essentially, but a control freak
Vice Squad.
Vice Squad. And I think, again, as a child of the culture, the period she lived through, and as independent as she was, she still was kind of formed by the notion of a strong man, and especially in the business side, he was,
He ran things.
yeah. I mean, he really controlled her life. Again, Ike and Tina, there's a parallel
Yeah,
with
yeah,
that.
yeah. No, I mean excuse me, the comments that she had at various times about being tired, and yet she was supposed to keep working.
Yeah.
Um,
Very,
you know,
very reminiscent. Very, very
yeah,
reminiscent. Great films, and for jazz lovers, but also just for people who are interested in the cultural history of our country and of our times. And for those of us like you and me who lived through that period, especially resonant, that those were heady times.
yeah. And I really didn't know it at the time. Why Nina. Well, you just stopped hearing her. The filmmaker makes it real clear that it was her politics. Um,
That silenced her.
and both in terms of available time, because of the amount of time she was then putting in to the movement, but also in terms of uh, it impacting her ability to have communication with
Right.
the general public.
Right. Well, one of the things too, around that period of time, I visited Hawaii, and my sister was living with her husband in Vietnam in 1966. Was my first visit to Hawaii. Had to deal with the draft and all that stuff, and went back to New York City in 1967. Got that resolved, and then came back here. And one of the reasons that I decided to get the hell out of New York City, but also out of the mainland, which still is, but at that time was incredibly racist, incredibly destructive, and at least out in Hawaii, it wasn't a racial paradise necessarily, but it wasn't one block of people, i.e., those of white flavor, sitting on people of color. the different racist stuff kind of were pedal, in the pond, waves with breaking on each other. And, I thought it was a great place to raise kids, where I did. So for me, that was my resolution of that incredibly ugly period of time of our history.
Yeah, with Nina, though, it's also interesting that the people who really first gave her original training as a piano player were white.
Yes.
The guitarist who was with her for all her prime years, at least, and still stuck with her indirectly, even towards the end, was white.
True.
She. It was an odd combination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the film highlights it, but doesn't really give you any real explanation.
That's true. That's true, and it's that's the complexity, because the fact is, these things like racism are across the board and kind of in the climate, but on a one-on-one basis, and especially for someone of international renown, of both Miles and Nina, it is totally colorblind, because it's the quality of the talent in working together that controls that, and is so that real world is what escapes the.
Yeah, even though Miles was so heavily in the Black community, I mean, his agent was white.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, how the relationships get formed and endure,
and complex. Yep.
And complex.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that's about all we can really say as to the movies themselves. So, what'd you think of the Oscars?
Well, and interesting. The film that won the Best Picture award, I saw first by myself and hated it. Saw it again after the Oscars with my wife, and she laughed her, Okoli off, and I caught the flavor of the comedy, and then I finally enjoyed it. And some real feel good stuff with the Vietnamese actor from Goonies and from Harrison Ford's film, and finally getting Time in the Sun. Jamie Lee Curtis, whose parents, Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh, never won any Oscar, and she won an Oscar, as she pointed out. Some real good stuff, and
yeah,
I thought Jimmy Kimmel did a good job.
Yeah, but in terms of the racial element, I mean, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah,
it was definitely very different. Well, I really appreciate your joining me to.
I enjoyed it.
And
it went very quickly.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Take care.
You too.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.